Hey everyone! Welcome back. Today we're sewing the Darcy multi-purpose pouch. It's a versatile organizer with a comfy handle for easy carrying. It opens up wide for a full view of everything inside at once. You'll love these features. No binding inside the pouch for a clean, smooth finish. A built-in phone stand for hands-free viewing. A handy mesh pocket with a zipper for visible, secure storage. A flexible partition, thanks to the Velcro. Rearrange or remove it easily. Elastic band slots, plus a large slot and some small slots for organized tools and essentials. Cord loop ends on the double slider zipper for effortless zipping. This sturdy pouch stands up on its own and keeps all your essentials in place. Ready to sew yours? Keep watching. Next, I'll show you exactly what materials you'll need and walk you through every step. Before we dive into sewing this pouch, let's go over the materials list you'll need for this awesome organizer. Front exterior. Back exterior. Handle. Zipper pocket mesh fabric. Back left side exterior. Back right side exterior. Front left side exterior. Front right side exterior. Top exterior. Bottom exterior. Zipper tab exterior. Front lining. Back lining. Back right side lining. Back left side lining. Top and sides lining. Bottom lining. Partition lining. Pocket lining for pocket 1. Pocket lining for pocket 2. Pocket lining for pocket 3. Rectangle gusset lining. Pentagon gusset lining. Partition lining. Left gusset lining. Right gusset lining. Zipper tab. Elastic band. Velcro. Cord. Double slider zipper. Single slider zipper. Bag stiffener sheet. Bias binding for the body. Binding for the partition panel. Binding for the zipper. Here's the list of materials you'll need to craft your pouch. So take a moment to ensure you have everything ready. If you need a sewing pattern, check the description below for a link to my shop, where you can download a pattern with clear, step-by-step instructions for this pouch. Once you've printed, joined, traced, cut, and interfaced your fabric pieces, you're ready to get started. Let's give this zipper some polished little ends. Start with one zipper tab exterior piece facing right side up. Lay the single slider zipper on top, also right side up, then place the second tab piece wrong side up, sandwiching the zipper in the middle. Line up all the left edges perfectly and make sure the zipper sits centered from top to bottom. A few clips keep everything from shifting. Repeat the process on the opposite end. Then we will slide it under the presser foot and stitch straight down with a 5mm seam allowance and a 2.5mm stitch length. Once stitched, flip both tab pieces outward so the pretty sides are showing. Give the seam a gentle finger press to get it lying nice and flat. For that clean, professional touch, top stitch just 2mm away from the seam using a longer 3.5mm stitch. An edge stitch foot makes it effortless, but an all-purpose presser foot works great too. Finally, fold the zipper in half lengthwise to find its midpoint. Snip a tiny notch in the tape or mark it with an erasable fabric marker. Now let's give the zipper pocket mesh a clean, finished edge. Flip the mesh piece so the wrong side faces up. Take the binding strip and lay it wrong side down, lining up one long raw edge perfectly with the top straight edge of the mesh. A few clips hold it steady without any slipping. Stitch that first edge with an 8mm seam allowance and a 2.5mm stitch length, running the needle right along the edge of the binding using the all-purpose presser foot. Next, flip the whole piece over and tug the binding upward, away from the seam. Flip over and fold it in half lengthwise. Then wrap it all the way around to the front so it completely covers the raw mesh edge. Give it a good finger press so the folded edge sits just above the stitching line that's already there. Clip the binding before sewing to keep the fold in place. For the final pass, top stitch about 2mm in from the folded edge with a 3.5mm stitch length. An edge stitch foot makes this effortless, but the all-purpose presser foot works beautifully too. The trick is keeping that new line just barely above the hidden stitching underneath. This guarantees the back of the binding gets caught perfectly. Once it's stitched, trim off any extra binding poking out at the ends for a tidy finish. Last little touch. Fold the whole pocket piece in half lengthwise. Find the exact center and pop a quick mark with an erasable fabric marker. Let's move on to binding the top edge of the zipper for a neat and polished finish. First, lay the zipper right side up. Place it over the wrong side of the binding strip, making sure the long edges match up nicely. Add a few clips or pins along the edge so everything stays in place for stitching. Next, stitch the binding to the zipper using a 6mm seam allowance and a 3mm stitch length. A zipper foot will help keep the stitching neat and close to the edge. Once that's done, flip the piece over and gently pull the binding away from the seam. Flip over and fold it in half toward the seam, then fold again so the raw edge is completely covered. Press it with fingers so the top edge sits just above the first stitching line. Secure with clips to keep it tidy. For the final touch, top stitch about 2 millimeters from the folded edge using a 3 millimeter stitch length. An edge stitch foot or a regular presser foot works well here. Keep the stitching slightly above the original line so the back of the binding is caught securely. If the stitch falls too low, the back might not hold, so aim for that sweet spot just above the first line. Now, we'll attach the zipper tape to the mesh fabric. The first thing to do is to add a few small marks with a heat erasable pen, about 6 millimeters above the bottom edge of the zipper. These little guides will make positioning the mesh nice and accurate later on. Next, position the mesh piece on top of the zipper tape. The mesh should already have its binding attached from the earlier step. Line up the bound edge with those marks, and don't forget to match the center marks on both pieces for perfect alignment. Once everything looks good, secure it with clips or pins so nothing shifts while sewing. We'll top stitch about 2 millimeters from the folded edge, using a 3 millimeter stitch length. Sew through all layers with an edge stitch foot or a zipper foot for a clean, professional finish. And that's it. This step creates the mesh zipper pocket piece, ready for the next part of the project. The final touch for the front lining is attaching the loop side of the Velcro. Begin by marking its position on the right side of the lining using an erasable fabric marker, following the template for accuracy. Next, place the loop side of the Velcro over the marked area. A little double-sided fabric tape can help keep it in place while stitching. Finally, secure it with a zigzag stitch around the edges. Set the machine to a 3 millimeter width and 1.6 millimeter length, and stitch close to the edge for a strong, clean finish. That completes this step beautifully. Okay, we'll now place the mesh zipper pocket piece right at the center of the front lining. Align its top edge with the notch for accurate positioning, then secure everything with clips or pins so it stays in place. Next, run a top stitch close to the top edge, just 2 millimeters away, with a 3 millimeter stitch length. A zipper foot makes this step smooth and tidy, but an all-purpose presser foot works fine too. Now, sew along the remaining 3 sides of the mesh zipper pocket using a 4 millimeter seam allowance and a 3 millimeter stitch length. Once the stitching is done, trim the pocket along the bottom and corners so it matches the shape of the lining perfectly. And just like that, the front lining is complete and ready for the next part of the build. In the last section, we finished working on the front lining. Now, let's move on to the back lining and get that part done. First, take pocket lining 1 and place it with the wrong side facing up. Fold it in half by bringing the two 13.5 centimeter ends together so the side edges line up perfectly. Give it a nice finger press or a light press with the iron to create a sharp crease, and then clip or pin that folded edge to keep it in place. Next, we're going to top stitch that folded edge. Measure 1 centimeter down from the fold and stitch straight across the width using a 3.5 millimeter stitch length and your all-purpose presser foot. Once that's done, repeat the same steps for the other two pocket linings. Now, we need to lay the partition lining with the right side facing up. Stack the 3 pocket pieces on top. First pocket piece 1, then pocket piece 2, and finally, pocket piece 3. Make sure all the bottom and side edges are perfectly aligned. Once everything is in position, clip the layers together to keep them steady. Stitch around the sides and bottom using a 5 millimeter seam allowance and a 5 millimeter stitch length with an all-purpose presser foot. When the stitching is complete, the semi-finished partition panel is ready to move on to the next step. All right, let's set up the semi-finished partition panel with the right side facing up. Now grab the pentagon gusset lining, flip it so the wrong side is up, and then bring in the rectangle gusset lining for the other side, wrong side up. Align all the edges and secure them with clips to prevent any shifting. We'll sew along both side edges using a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a 3 millimeter stitch length. Once that's done, trim the corners of the seams. Cut small triangular notches close to the stitching, but don't snip through the stitches. This helps reduce bulk and gives a cleaner finish. And there it is. The front partition panel is fully assembled and ready for the next step. All right, let's bring the assembled front partition panel and the back partition panel together. Grab the assembled front partition panel from earlier and the back partition panel. Flip them so the right side's facing together. Line everything up nice and snug, and pop in some clips all the way around to hold them perfectly in place. Next, stitch along the left side and the top edge using a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a 3 millimeter stitch length with an all-purpose presser foot. Once that's sewn, grab the scissors and carefully notch into those corners. Just snip close to the stitching without cutting the thread. This little trick gets rid of extra bulk so everything turns out smooth and sharp. Flip the whole piece right side out. There we go. Looking good already. To make those corners pop like they should, a point turner or chopstick works wonders to poke them into perfect shape. Finger press along all the seams to set them nice and crisp. For that extra polished look, press with an iron over the seams locks everything in place beautifully. Align all the edges and secure them with clips to prevent any shifting. Next, top stitch 2 mm from the seam using a 3.5 mm stitch length. After that, top stitch down the right edge of the semi-finished partition panel with the same 3.5 mm stitch length. An edge stitch foot makes it feel almost effortless, but an all-purpose presser foot works fine too. Now the partition is fully assembled and looking sharp. Let's give it a neat professional finish by binding that long raw edge and adding the Velcro. Flip the assembled partition so the wrong side faces up. Grab the binding tape and fold it lengthwise, bringing one long raw edge in by about 1 centimeter so it tucks neatly inside. Give it a quick finger press for that crisp, clean edge. Place the binding tape along the bottom raw edge, keeping the right side against the partition. Make sure the folded edge lines up neatly with the gusset edge for a clean finish. Clip or pin everything in place so it stays secure while sewing. Next, stitch down the long edge with an 8 mm seam allowance and a 3 mm stitch length. Once that line is sewn, turn the binding tape so the right side faces up. Gently press the seam allowance open with fingers to create a crisp, flat edge. This step ensures the binding will fold smoothly and lie perfectly in the next stage. Next, flip the whole piece over so the right side of the partition is now on top. Fold the binding in half toward the seam line, then fold it once more so the clean edge wraps all the way around and hides the raw edge completely. Smooth it down with fingers, making sure the top folded edge sits just a tiny bit above the first stitching line. Add a few clips along the edge to lock everything in place. Now we're going to top stitch about 2 mm from the folded binding edge. Set your stitch length to 3.5 mm for a nice, clean finish. You can use an edge stitch foot for extra precision, or just stick with your all-purpose foot if that's what you have. With the top stitching complete, grab a sharp pair of scissors and neatly trim away any excess binding that extends past the end. Lastly, grab the hook side of the Velcro and center it along the back edge of the pentagon gusset. Sew all the way around the Velcro using a zigzag stitch. staying nice and close to the edge. We can sew the elastic band and assemble the partition to the back lining now. Start by laying the back lining piece flat, right side facing up. Make sure those little template dots for the elastic placement are clearly marked. They're the guides for everything coming next. Next, grab the elastic band. At each short end, fold over a neat 5mm and add a tiny dab of fabric glue to keep that fold perfectly flat. Once the ends are prepped, mark 2 small dots on both the top and bottom edges, spacing them 3 centimeters apart and keeping everything nice and even. Now line up the right folded edge of the elastic band with the matching dots on the right side of the back lining. Slide it under the presser foot and top stitch a clean line just 2mm in from the fold, using a 2.5mm stitch length. An edge stitch foot works beautifully here, but an all-purpose presser foot does the job just as well. With the right side locked in place, it's time to shape those loops. Bring the marked dots on the top edge down to meet their partners on the bottom edge, creating 3 equal sections. Stitch 3 straight vertical lines right through both layers. And just like that, the elastic band sits securely on the back lining, ready for the next step. Time to sew the partition panel and back lining together. First, lay the assembled back lining flat with the right side facing up. Take the finished partition panel, also right side up, and place it directly on top. Line up the dots on the back lining with the left seam of the main partition section. The top right corner of the rectangular gusset needs to meet the right notch exactly. Once everything is aligned, add clips around the edges to lock the layers in position. Next, we'll top stitch that left seam line of the main partition, using the all-purpose presser foot and a 3mm stitch length. Now shift focus to the right side. Adjust the pieces so the right edges line up flush, then secure with clips to hold them firmly in place. We'll stitch down the right edges with a 4mm seam allowance and a 5mm stitch length. This joins the gusset to the back lining. There it is. The assembled back lining is now complete. Begin with the left gusset lining. Fold it neatly in half, wrong sides touching, bringing the center notch right to the triangle tip. A quick finger press sets a crisp crease down the middle, and a couple of clips keep it locked in place. Run a stitch straight along that center crease with a narrow 2mm seam allowance and a 3.5mm stitch length. The edge stitch foot glides perfectly here, but the all-purpose presser foot handles it just as smoothly. Now, with the triangle tip pointing to the right, create the side crease. Fold a clean vertical line starting at the notch, running parallel to the side edge and right over the triangle. Press firmly to lock in that sharp fold. Stitch directly on this new crease line. Same settings, 2mm seam allowance and 3.5mm length. For a secure, polished finish. And there's the completed left gusset. The right gusset follows the exact same steps, just mirrored. This time, keep the triangle tip pointing left for proper orientation. Fold the vertical line from the notch, parallel to the side edge, and over the triangle, then press for a defined crease. One more stitching pass along that crease with the same 2mm seam allowance and 3.5mm length, and the right gusset is done. Both gussets are now perfectly folded and stitched, sharp, symmetrical, and eager for the next assembly step. Let's prepare the handle strap now. Spread the handle fabric out lengthwise, wrong side up. Grab an erasable fabric marker and draw a light straight line right down the middle from one end to the other. Bring each long raw edge inward, folding them to meet along that marked center. Next, fold the entire piece in half along the same center line, encasing those raw edges inside. The strap now measures about 2.5 centimeters wide. Clip or pin along the length to hold that shape securely. Slide it under the machine for top stitching. Run a line down each long edge about 3 millimeters in, with a stitch length between 3.5 and 4 millimeters. The edge stitch foot makes those lines super straight and close, but the all-purpose presser foot delivers excellent results too. Fold the finished strap widthwise to locate the exact midpoint, and add a small mark with the erasable fabric marker or a pin. Align the handle strap's midpoints with the top exterior notches, then secure both ends firmly using clips or pins. We'll stitch each end down with a 5mm seam allowance and a 3mm stitch length. The edge stitch foot keeps the line precise along the strap, but the all-purpose presser foot works fine too. Now onto the zipper. Bend the thin cords into a smooth U shape, keeping the ends parallel. Place the double slider zipper right side up, then align the cord ends flush with the left edge of the zipper tape. Use a couple of clips to hold them in position temporarily. Stitch the ends to the tape using a 5mm seam allowance and 2.5mm stitch length with the all-purpose presser foot. A few back stitches right over the cord lock everything in securely. Next, place both zipper tab exteriors wrong side up, aligning their left edges with the zipper tape and cord. Secure them firmly with clips. Sew along the aligned edges using a 1cm seam allowance and a 2.5mm stitch length. Backstitch over the cord for added strength. Flip the tabs outward to reveal their right sides, then finish with a decorative top stitch 2mm from the seam using a 3.5mm stitch length. For best results, use an edge stitch foot, though an all-purpose presser foot works just as well. Finally, fold the zipper lengthwise to locate the center. Snip a tiny notch in the tape or add a quick mark with an erasable fabric marker. Starting with the top exterior panel, lay it right side up. Make sure those 3 notches are sitting along the top edge to keep everything oriented correctly. Now, take the front left side exterior and place it wrong side up on top. The straight horizontal edge goes at the top with the slanted side toward the bottom. Line up the left edges and secure with clips or pins along that side. Next, stitch down the edge with an 8mm seam allowance and a 2.5mm stitch length. With the left side now attached, keep the assembly right side up on the table. Those 3 notches still marking the top edge for perfect orientation. Bring in the front right side exterior and flip it wrong side up. Position it so the straight horizontal edge lines up at the top while the slanted angle points downward. Carefully match the right edge of the top panel with the right edge of the side exterior, then lock the layers together with clips or pins down that entire side. Sew along the edge with the same settings: 8mm seam allowance, straight stitch, 2.5mm stitch length. To ease bulk at those angled corners, grab sharp scissors and carefully notch the seam allowances by snipping triangles right up close to the stitching line. Just be mindful not to nick any threads. Now, let's add that finishing touch. Top stitch 5mm from the seam with a 3.5mm stitch length, using either an edge stitch foot or an all-purpose presser foot. Work along the front left side exterior and front right side exterior. This step creates a sleek decorative line and reinforces the seam for durability. There it is. Both front sides now beautifully connected to the top, forming a crisp assembled top and front sides exterior. Now place the double slider zipper wrong side up along that slanted top, centering it perfectly using the middle notch as the anchor. Let the tape extend equally on both sides, then secure everything with clips. Next, bring the top and front sides lining wrong side up, layering it over the zipper. Match all the edges and slants precisely, again centering from that middle notch outward. Attach the zipper foot, set a 3mm stitch length, and sew with a 6mm seam allowance right along the edge. At the start, you might notice the foot bumping against the zipper tab underneath. Don't panic. Just slow down, take your time, and if it feels too tight, switch to the hand wheel and manually guide those first few stitches through. As the needle approaches the cord loop or pull tab, pause with the needle down, lift the foot, and carefully shift the tab or loop out of the stitching path before continuing. This keeps the line smooth and prevents anything from getting caught. Once sewn, turn the panel right side out. Ease out the corners and slants gently with a point turner or fingertips for crisp, defined edges. Then bring the iron in for that polished touch. Press firmly along the seam, hugging close to the zipper teeth. Once the panel is smooth and flat, top stitch on the exterior side, just 2mm from the seam. A 3.5mm stitch length gives a clean, visible finish, and using an edge stitch foot or zipper foot ensures the line stays close and perfectly straight. Now for the zipper tabs. With an erasable fabric marker, draw a straight continuation of the side edge from the front right side exterior across the zipper tape. Trim neatly along that line for a seamless flush fit. Repeat the marking and trimming on the left side to mirror the right. Perfect symmetry all around. All done. The top and front sides panel fully assembled, zipper integrated, edges sharp, and ready for the next stage. Let's dive into attaching the back left panels and gusset to the zipper. Start by marking that subtle taper on the seam allowance at the tip of the back left side exterior piece. Flip it wrong side up and locate the pointed end along the slanted edge. From the tip, measure 3.5 centimeters along the edge and then 6 millimeters inward perpendicular to it. Next, drop straight down just 2 millimeters from the tip for the ending point. Connect those two dots with an erasable fabric marker to guide a gentle taper down to a 2mm seam allowance right at the point. Now, lay the assembled panel from the previous step right side up. Place the back left side exterior wrong side up over it, positioning the right angle corner toward the bottom left. Carefully line up the slanted edge with the top of the zipper tape, matching perfectly, and hold everything in place with clips. Flip the whole clipped assembly over so the wrong side faces up. Bring in the left gusset, fresh from earlier preparation. Position it at the bottom right corner of the panel with the rectangular base along the bottom and the triangular section pointing downward. Match the right corner and bottom edge of the gusset precisely with the panels and secure with clips. Then, gently fold the triangular tip of the gusset upward so its slanted side meets the zipper tape edge exactly. Then clip it securely along the zipper. Layer the back left side lining wrong side up on top next. Slide it so the right angle corner sits toward the right, aligning its corner with the panels. Bring the slanted edge flush with the zipper and the gusset underneath for perfect registration, and clip everything firmly. We'll switch to the zipper foot and stitch along that slanted edge with a 6mm seam allowance and 3mm stitch length. Glide smoothly from one end toward the tip in a single pass. To make sewing easier, consider hand basting the clipped layers together along the bottom and right edges where the gusset meets the panel. As the mark taper approaches, follow the drawn line closely to ease the seam allowance down to just 2mm at the point. Nice and gradual for a sharp finish. Once stitched, press the seam alongside the zipper with a warm iron to set it flat and crisp. The zipper should lie perfectly smooth, and the fabrics even. A touch of fabric glue at the tip can help tame any bulk if needed. For that polished look, carefully hold the lining out of the way. With an edge stitch foot or zipper foot, top stitch 2mm from the seam on the back left exterior side, using a 3.5mm stitch length. Begin right beside the zipper and continue along for a clean decorative line that also reinforces the seam beautifully. Now, mirror the process on the opposite side with the right gusset for perfect symmetry. Begin by marking the gentle taper on the wrong side of the back right side exterior. Lay the assembled panel right side up, then align the slanted edge of the side exterior precisely with the zipper tape and clip securely. Flip the assembly wrong side up, then place the right gusset at the bottom left corner and clip in place. Fold the gusset's triangular tip upward to meet the zipper edge exactly, and secure with clips. Layer the back right side lining wrong side up, and clip everything firmly. For added control, a quick hand baste along the bottom and side edges inside the seam allowance keeps layers from shifting. Switch to the zipper foot and stitch the slanted edge with a 6mm seam allowance and 3mm length, following the marked line to taper smoothly to 2mm at the tip. Press the seam flat beside the zipper for that crisp finish, adding a dab of fabric glue at the point if it helps. Finally, hold the lining aside and top stitch 2mm from the edge on the back right exterior side with a 3.5mm length, starting next to the zipper, for a sharp, reinforced detail. Time to give this top and sides panel its final structure. Slide the bag stiffener sheet right into the top panel. Position it against the lining side, then gently smooth everything out to make sure it lies perfectly flat and fits snugly all around, with no wrinkles or edges peeking over. Next, take a moment to line up all the exterior, lining pieces and gussets precisely, and grab some clips to hold the layers securely together without shifting. Now, switch to the all-purpose presser foot, then baste the side edges using a 4mm seam allowance and a 5mm stitch length. And there it is. The assembled top and sides panel is now fully complete. Let's dive into attaching the back panel to the assembled top and sides panel. The assembled top and sides panel is laid out right side up. The back exterior piece comes on top, wrong side up, carefully lining up those side edges right next to the zipper. To hold everything steady, clips or pins work great along those aligned sides. For extra control, especially around the corners, a quick hand baste can make the machine stitching much smoother. We'll use a zipper foot and sew down the edge using a 4mm seam allowance and a 3mm stitch length. Before you head to the sewing machine, make sure that zipper is all the way open. It'll keep things flat and easy while you sew. Now, moving on to the lining side. The assembled top and sides panel stays right side up. The back lining piece goes on top, wrong side up, again matching those side edges beside the zipper precisely. Secure the edges the same way. Clips, pins, or a light hand baste for precision. This time, stitch along the sides with the zipper foot, using a slightly wider 6mm seam allowance while keeping the 3mm stitch length. To ease bulk at the corners, add small V-shaped notches, about 4mm deep and spaced roughly 5mm apart, being careful not to snip into the stitching. Once that's done, gently turn the entire piece right side out by pushing the fabric through the opening. A chopstick or similar pointed tool helps sharpen those corners beautifully. If desired, a quick press with the iron on low heat flattens the edges for a clean, professional finish. Finally, take a close look at the seams. Everything should be caught nicely, and the fabric needs to lie perfectly flat without any unwanted puckers from rushing the smoothing step earlier. Next, we'll connect the front pieces to the assembled top and side panels. Start with the exterior. Place the assembled panel right side up, then position the front exterior piece wrong side up directly on top, carefully aligning the side edges for a seamless fit. Secure the sides with clips or pins. For added stability, lightly hand-baste around the corners or along the full edge. This extra step ensures smooth, controlled stitching. With the zipper fully open to clear the path, attach the zipper foot for close, precise work. Stitch along the edges using a 4mm seam allowance and a 3mm stitch length. Once stitched, turn the piece right side out and pause for a thorough seam check. Confirm that every layer is securely captured with no gaps or missed sections, and that the fabric lies completely smooth and even across the surface. Small puckers or tucks usually indicate the pieces weren't fully flattened or aligned before sewing, so catching them now helps achieve that clean, polished finish. Shifting to the lining side. The assembled panel from the previous step stays right side up. The front lining piece goes on top, wrong side up, matching those same side edges opposite the zipper. This spot has more layers, plus the bag stiffener, so alignment needs extra care. Clips or pins help, but hand-basting the corners, or the whole edge, before heading to the machine truly makes the difference for accurate, frustration-free stitching. The zipper foot stays on, and sewing runs along the edges with a wider 6mm seam allowance, still at a 3mm stitch length. As always, before heading to the machine for those final stitches, especially with multiple layers and tricky corners, take a moment to hand baste the entire clipped edge. It's one of those thoughtful steps that really pays off for a frustration-free finish. While you're basting, run your fingers gently along the edge to smooth out every layer. This becomes second nature, checking for even the tiniest wrinkle, twist, or bunching that could cause trouble later. To trim excess bulk at the corners, small V-shaped notches are added, roughly 4mm deep and about 5mm apart, without ever nicking the stitches. Once that's done, turn the piece right side out and carefully inspect the seams. Ensure all layers are fully caught with no gaps or missed areas, and that the fabric lies flat and smooth without any puckers or unevenness. And there it is. The assembled body is now complete and ready for the next stage. And here we are at the final exciting step, attaching the bottom panel to give the bag its full structure and that satisfying finished look. We'll start with the bottom panel assembly. Place the exterior and lining pieces wrong sides together, then carefully align every edge for a perfect match. A few clips or pins will keep everything steady and prevent shifting. Next, switch to a zigzag stitch using your all-purpose presser foot, set to 3mm width and 2mm length. Run that zigzag all around the perimeter. This locks the two layers together beautifully while keeping the panel neat and flexible. Now that the bottom panel is assembled and stabilized, it's time to join it to the main body. Position the panel so the lining sides face each other, and match the edges precisely all the way around. Secure with clips to hold everything in place. With the exterior side facing up, introduce the bias binding tape along the raw bottom edge, making sure the wrong side of the tape sits against the seam allowance. To create a perfect closed loop, bring the two short ends of the tape together right sides facing. Mark the overlap with an erasable fabric marker, then pin the ends perpendicular to the edge so nothing shifts as you move to the machine. Stitch straight across that marked line with a standard straight stitch to connect the ends securely. Trim away the excess fabric close to the seam to reduce bulk, leaving a clean, continuous ring ready for the next phase. Before heading to the machine, take a moment to hand baste the entire bottom edge. This extra step keeps all those layers perfectly aligned and prevents shifting, making the final stitching smooth and stress-free. Once the hand basting is complete, it's time to switch things up. Attach the zipper foot. Its slim design lets you glide effortlessly close to the binding. Now, stitch the first side of the bias tape with an 8mm seam allowance and a 3mm stitch length, capturing everything securely in one smooth, confident pass. Next, flip the piece over and gently pull the bias tape away from the seam. Fold it neatly to enclose the raw edge. A double fold brings the binding just over the previous stitching line. Finger press for a crisp edge that sits perfectly in place and secure it with clips for the final touch. To finish, hand-stitch the folded binding edge using a blind stitch to complete the seam. This creates a clean, invisible finish that looks polished on the outside and strong on the inside. The bottom panel now sits clean and professional, adding structure and polish to the entire design. And just like that, the pouch is fully complete. It features a clean, binding-free interior, a built-in phone stand for hands-free viewing, a zippered mesh pocket for secure storage, a removable Velcro partition, and multiple elastic bands and slots to keep essentials organized. The double slider zipper with cord loops makes access effortless, while its sturdy design stands upright on its own, keeping everything neat and in place. If this little pouch has caught the eye and feels like the perfect project to make, The full pattern with all the detailed instructions, measurements, and templates is available for purchase right here in the link below the video. Thanks so much for sewing along to the very end. Happy stitching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.